I just really want to thank you for having me. I love your bookstore so much, and I wish I could be there in person. And it's really making me very happy to look at the shelf behind you and picture myself there, and with all of you friends who are showing up. And even my mother can come all the way from Chicago. So nice. So I'm just going to read a little while because I'm really excited about this beautiful book by Jill, and I really want to get to that. Um, so I'll read maybe 5 or so poems from my book, and then maybe a couple poems in progress that aren't published in the book for fun. If you feel like seeing the cover, here it is. I love the design. They kind of based it on the idea of hardware store paint samples, which I always have loved, even since I was a child. Okay, so this first one I wrote before quarantine started, but I think it's pretty timely in that it's about the slowness of the passage of time and a kind of a prayer to be with slowness, which we all can't sort of help but be right now, with the exception of essential workers who are not in the slowness of time at all. So it's called Prayer. Let the day open slow around you. Let the night open slow around you. Let the spring open slow, the fall open slow, the waking animals open their eyes slow around you. Let the night close slow around you. Let the day close slow around you. The winter close slow, the summer close slow. The sleeping animals close their eyes slow around you. It's also a prayer for my dog to be quiet while I read. So I hope she's sleeping. I hope that put her to sleep. Just as a nap. As I love my dog. The second one is a little love poem. It's called Tithe. Supposing I loved you with simple grace, untoward, untried, with reversal of tithe, unchurched meaning this, I would give 9/10 of my thoughts to you and 1/10 to the rest of the world. Supposing the little earthenware jug in my chest were to get full of practical things, lamp here, lamp there, bread, sleep. And I guess I should say the title of this collection, 44 Poems for You, um, there's sort of a person of dedication in each of the poems. Um, and I was partly inspired by Lewis Hyde's seminal book, The Gift, where he talks about being in a gift economy, even though you're trying to survive in a capitalist economy. So the you is sort of an implied recipient. The next poem is called Max, with thanks to Maurice Sendak. And this I wrote for my dear friend and former student Max Ritvo, who's a really luminous, extraordinary poet who died 4 years ago. He had a rare pediatric cancer, and he was my student at Yale. And Max and I became quite close and wrote letters back and forth. And he died 4 years ago, August. I keep track of it because I know he didn't know that Trump was elected, which we were all, it seemed like a slight saving grace. Anyway, this poem is for Max. Death no wild thing and you a boy, Max. One night in your room or body a forest grew, and the walls or cells became transparent, because brightness invites transparency, I guess. Then a little boat to hospital smells. Doctors called the forest cancer, not obscuring leaves, and you a boy. You say, why can't people use the word courage instead of something vulgar and idiomatic about manhood? Courage, I say, is you, Max. In your wild suit, your small boat and terrible forest, a man overnight, no boy could ever scale those walls. You come home and dinner is waiting, still waiting, I hope, still warm. And today, my small boy learned to swim. He said, the water held me, Mama. It held me. And the last poem I'm going to read from this book is called Summer, Rhode Island, for my husband, Tony. And I'm in Rhode Island now. And it's such a beautiful state. We were just talking about it before we got on. It's been a really beautiful place to spend time in quarantine. And I lived here for 7 years earlier, so it feels like home. And I don't know if you saw the Democratic convention where it really made a name for itself as the calamari appetizer state. So anyway, I love it here. It's just called Summer, Rhode Island. You know what a lee is, I don't. Behind a stone, no wind, stop boat, a place. Behind your back, my body, stop the air, travel by stopping, full stop, just there. As lee is a small word, sail easy, lee and unlee, light is hot. Rest here a while longer on my belly, a lee, a dry dairy, a drought. August, marsh sounds, marsh looks, a fairy. Look for other words, lucid, pellucid, call a mind a pond, call a pond a mind. Lucid, penitent mendicants on a pond. Words for clarity, words for light and heat, words for charity, words for sleep. I also just want to thank Michael at Copper Canyon and all the folks over there for having such a beautiful experience making this book. And I'm just going to read a couple little poems in progress that I've written since COVID, and then hand it over to Jill. This one's pretty self-explanatory in terms of all the laundry we've all been doing. And it's called What Are We Folding When We Are Folding Laundry in Quarantine? Standing 4 feet apart, you take one edge of the sheet, I take the other. We walk towards one another, creating order. Like solemn campers folding a flag in the early morning light. But this is no flag. This is where we love and sleep. There was a time we forgot to do this, to fold with and toward one another, to make the edges clean together. My grandmother might have said, there is always more laundry to do, and that is a blessing, because it means you did more living, which means you get to do more cleaning. We forgot for a while that one large blanket is too difficult for one chin to hold and 2 hands to fold alone, that there is more beauty in the walking towards the fold and in the shared labor. And then I'll close with this poem that I wrote after George Floyd was murdered. It's called White Backup Singers, June 1st. I didn't want to watch that video, but I did. I watched it. I watched a uniformed man put his knee on another man's neck, watched him press the life out unmoved, as though there wasn't a man under the weight of his uniform body, as though the man under him was a fly or a dog. I watched the brown face lose life minute by minute, and I watched the white face, impassive, looking at some murderous internal horizon line. From the privacy of my home, I watched a man die, and the whole country watched his murder, and the whole country came out of the privacy of their homes and took to the streets. And I hear my brothers and sisters saying, white silence is white violence. And I hear my brothers and sisters saying, we are exhausted. Can't you carry this burden for once? And I also hear my brothers and sisters saying, for one holy week, can you shut up? We are speaking. Let our voices be the ones that are heard. And I say yes to both, those calling for white people to speak up and those calling for white people to shut up. And so a small offering, a middle way, I will be your white backup singer. Because I always hated the lyric in that Lou Reed song about the black backup singers who we asked to sing, did you, and then they do. Fuck that. I will be your backup singer if you want me to. Even though I'm a bad singer, I will practice and I will stand behind you. And if Janelle Monáe says say his name, I will say his name, George Floyd. And if Killer Mike says say his name, I will say his name, George Floyd. And if Alicia Garza says say his name, I will say his name, George Floyd. And if you tell me you don't need me to sing, I will be quiet. And if you tell me I need to be louder, I will be louder. George Floyd, George Floyd, George Floyd, George Floyd. Thank you all so much for listening and being present virtually. And I can't wait to hear Jill's poems.
Thank you, Sarah. That was beautiful. And tonight's other featured author is Jill Bialosky. Her newest volume of poetry is Asylum, a personal, historical, natural inquiry in 103 lyric sections. She's the author of 5 acclaimed collections of poetry, 3 critically acclaimed novels, most recently The Prize, and 2 memoirs, Poetry Will Save Your Life, and the New York Times bestselling memoir, History of a Suicide, My Sister's Unfinished Life. Her poems and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, O Magazine, The Kenyon Review, Harvard Review, and Paris Review, among others. She co-edited with Helen Schulman and the anthology Wanting a Child. She is an executive editor and vice president at W.W. Norton and Company. In 2014, she was honored by the Poetry Society of America for her distinguished contribution to poetry. With that, I will ask her to read from her new collection.
Okay, excuse me. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, McNally Jackson, for hosting us and for being such a wonderful indie bookstore. I miss wandering in the Soho shop, but that will be soon, I hope. I'm so happy to be reading and in conversation with Sarah. She is just such a beautiful writer, and I admire her work, her poetry, and her plays. So this is really a, just so very honored to do this today. And thank you all for showing up for us. I just want to say briefly about Asylum, since it's was written as a book-length sequence, that I set out to examine sort of the different forms of sanctuary and asylum in societies where racism and violence, terror, anti-Semitism, climate change are threats to our humanity. And in these 103 lyric sections, I circle the lasting effects of a sister's suicide, a mother's joy and concern for raising a son in such turbulent times. I also circle ideas of natural evolution, particularly of trees and butterflies and their connections to the human world. There's also a homage to a dying mother, and the voice of a yoga teacher runs through the book as well. So I'll try to touch on a few of these threads in this reading of some of the numbered sections, but I'm just going to sort of read them through without announcing the number of the section. Some cultures believed if you stood tall with your back against a tree, because they were steady in sync with the circadian and seasonal rhythm of the universe, and breathed your longing into its ballast, if you were patient and focused, your beloved would find you. Those long afternoons we trudged through the North Woods. Some days it was insufferable, the cold, and still we traveled through the abyss where the black cherry, pine oak, and red maple were stripped of their clothes and the wind slapped our faces, furies blotting our eyes, and no foreseeable path in the snow, and still we made the journey. Sometimes we stumbled upon more than we wanted, how to explain a body with a blanket over a subway grate for warmth, or the babble of the mind's asylum, those decorated with gold of the privileged, those without shoes. Still, it was like an accident of joy, like a chorus gathering, like a gift from a mysterious God. It was like the unknown whisper of trees in the park's forest. It was the shadow life I feared. Washing dishes, occasionally looking out at the wood and at one bird circling the nest and at the pollen dust raining from the greenery that has gathered, not simply as a nuisance in our pool, but as a miracle of procreation. And it was as if seeing pollen for the first time. Trees breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide, releasing energy and water into the air. Some birth flowers of only one sex, and others both male and female flowers. The same way we bear fruit to those we bear, and those who bear us. Even trees are in the presence of the divine, we were told. In some cultures, they are thought to have a consciousness, to feel happiness and pain. Some are twisted, some antithetical to the profane. In tree pose, otherwise known as Virabhadrasana, our yoga teacher says to stand on one leg for balance. Move the sole of the other foot into the inner thigh of the standing leg. Once you've found your balance, put your hands in prayer in front of your chest and then raise them over your head, arms to ears. Stand tall, steady, grow, she says. Root yourself to the ground. Breathe. We kept our heads down. We were entranced, focused. Sometimes we could not see anything before us. That's what it required. One year I had forgotten the first leaves of spring. I had forgotten all the years of toil. I looked up and trees had flowered. All it took was waiting out the bleak winter, the hemisphere of darkness. The color was lime green. I wanted to tell her, this is what it's like. Every April, a requiem, a reawakening of dawn, the same chorus and players, the garage door sealed, gas turned on, and the girl once aidled by a broken heart, by a mind that won't stop, by the ticker tape of loneliness. There she is again, slumped against the door, hair tangled around her neck, effervescent eyes closed, rings and bracelets catching the hint of morning sun. The myth of the girl unraveling when the boy who arrives to cut the lawn opens the garage door to fetch the lawnmower and finds her. The birds are trumpets and flutes, the wind a piano, daffodils are frozen, shock of forsythia withering in the cold, tulips trampled, pollen has not yet released, buds not yet opened. It is April again, and all the trees bow for the final coda. Turquoise plates extremely rare as the orange-footed Fiesta bowl that decorated our table and held the sour green apples she adored. Books, clothes, bronze baby shoes, portraits and paintings, images and memories, alive through objects, stripped from the house in which they once resided, and all but a few precious items sold to a liquidator. I remember her glee, a hero for what no mother should bear, more permanent than any object, at the flea markets in Chardon, where we trolled for treasured pieces of Fiesta ware. Once we found her favorite, though she did not like to choose. Which one died, she said, confused, pointing to the photos of her 4 daughters above her bed, once she moved into the care home's prelude for the soon-to-be dead. A vintage ivory pitcher that now most likely resides in a stranger's abode. And just a few more. Another spray of violence, boy shot dead for the color of skin or the supremacy of a race. A man choked by the police for selling single cigarettes. I can't breathe, I can't breathe. School children taken down by a lone terrorist. Eldest members of the Tree of Life synagogue massacred. Souls who live inside those that mourn, they can never kill. They, the purveyors of hate, I told him, my cherished one. While in another room of the synagogue, a bris, a ceremony to celebrate the birth of a baby boy, to seal his covenant, is taking place. Then I wanted to, end with a yoga poem. Snowflakes, each its own composition of frozen water. Complex bodies made up of elements necessary for sustaining life. Oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. If we focus on our breath, our control shifts from the brain stem to the cerebral cortex, and the mind quiets. Eyes closed, resting on our backs out of generosity, kindness, our teacher sometimes places her 2 hands beside the back of our head and elongates the neck to give the body more room to heal what is broken. And this is the last one. The winter where the sparrows quieted, in which the snow would not stop, in which the rats would not come out, in which we feared for our safety and snow covered the bereft shrubs. Homeless, here I am you, sought shelter, fearful stockpiled water and provisions. The winter, a strain of virus quarantined us far into spring, in which another teenager somewhere in the city is locked in a sephoric fog, helpless, forgotten, isolated in aloneness, landscape shrouded in an unreasonable mask, winter of the symphony's grand crescendo, seats of council, judges assemble to form a decree. Citizenry run amok is not a matter of the individual, but society. Timpani, cymbals, snare drum, family of percussion. And thank you. Thank you all for listening. Sarah, I just loved your new poem that you read, the last poem, just so moving and important. I'm glad that you said the names in the poem, and I wondered if you wanted to speak about that choice.
Mm-hmm. I just think it's a powerful call to say people's names. I think it's incredibly important to remember each name, and I think it's a kind of it's ancient, it's elegy, it's ritual, it's also political activism for all these names that often don't get to be said in public discourse, and feeling like white people are finally waking up and saying them too. I mean, I think Black people have been saying these names for a long time and white people haven't. So it feels like a real call to action. And I just want to say I loved your book so much and your reading from it, and it's such an honor to be in dialogue with you. And it was interesting that some themes in your book also presage the moment that we're in. And I wondered when you titled it Asylum, um, uh, were we dealing with this political moment yet? Like, were there people in cages yet at the border? Or at what point did you finish the manuscript?
Yes. Well, first, I wanted to just comment on what you just said about names, because it reminded me of this wonderful book of poetry that that we published at Norton by Alice Oswald called Memorial, where in the book she says the names of the the foot soldiers in the Iliad.
Huh.
So, you know, that's just an interesting
Yeah.
sort of comparison, I think, to what you just said. You know, Asylum, I started writing the book in really in 2016. And it was, you know, I really didn't know. I started out wanting to think about how language and how being a poet sort of took over my life in a way. It started out very personally, and then, you know, the world just, so many acts of violence were unleashed in the months and years that I began working on it. And so those voices started entering the piece, and I just couldn't quiet those voices. And so I felt that they kind of needed to come in, and you know, then yes, with migrants being put into pens and asylum of these different asylums, I was just, that word just kept resonating, and some of the natural images of trees and butterflies in the book come from my, we have a house outside of the city, and we've had it for 20 years, and I've watched this sort of stand of trees over time, and how some survive and others get blotted out by either lack of sun or vines. And I just started thinking about the connections between the world, the natural world of trees, and then survival. You know, how do we survive these terrible atrocities and still maintain our human hope and dignity? So I think that's one way of answering your question. But I was interested in how you use, and because I like to use rhyme too, I really love in your book how you play with sound and rhyme. And I wondered if you wanted to speak about that. You know, how one sort of, I know for me, like sometimes one word or sound invites another sound, but I'm curious how that works for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love rhyme, and I think in some poetic circles it seems a little old-fashioned, but I find it kind of unavoidable and incantatory and delightful. And you know, one poem I love in your book, which is hard to read out loud because you really need to see it on the page. I think it's raining and raining and raining and raining and raining and and then it goes through each iteration of raining like a king who reigns, and like reigns of leashes. And I love sounds that kind of do things and enact things. And I also just wanted to speak to what you said about the natural world in your book. And for all of you who go out and buy the book, which I'm sure you will, it's a different reading experience to read the whole as opposed to read singular poems, because they're all woven together, and it does feel almost like this moving meditation. It does feel, I think, yogic, and then it goes into the past, and then it has these trees who are almost these witnesses. I
Mm.
felt like this world of tree witnesses kind of reminding us that there was another kind of time, a kind of bigger cosmic time, even as we were going through generational historical trauma and then individual trauma, that these trees were kind of standing there and watching. And you, one line in your book about how some trees die too young because they're isolated, because they aren't getting enough nourishment from trees in a grove. And when I was rereading it this week, that felt really powerful. And this time of quarantine, this idea of a tree needing and needing a little grove of trees needing each other.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. I was very interested in your book in this idea of 44 poems for you. And I was wondering if you could talk about that. I mean, there, for people who haven't read the book, there's some beautiful poems, and you read one of them for your former student, Max, and then there are some what I would call love poems and poems about your children. But this idea of you, for me, was like an invitation to the reader. And I was wondering how that idea evolved for you.
Mm-hmm. I think partly it evolved because I was secretive about my poems for a while. I wrote them literally as gifts for people, and then I just squirreled them away. So they really were meant for these other individuals. And at a point, I had enough of them, and it felt like they could be a book. And really, my former student, Max Riffo, was very encouraging of me sharing my poetry, which, was such a reversal of roles. Because I'm primarily a playwright and was kind of used to sharing things in that way, and less used to sharing poems that were sort of these private gift poems. So I guess that's the origin, is that they were quite literally, many of them written for others. And I sort of couldn't stop writing poetry while I was writing plays. I started out by writing poetry and then moved into playwriting. But at a point, the potential for public humiliation in playwriting seemed just it was enough. That was enough, and sharing poetry seemed quite vulnerable. So it took me a long time.
What one of the poems that I love of yours is called "Why Even Speak of It," and the very last lines, it's not, the poem is numbered in 6 stanzas, but you write, "Why even speak of it? Because you said, write me a happy poem on the occasion of my sadness." I love that.
Oh, thank you.
I can't. I keep trying to think about your plays are in a way very different from your poetry. Maybe because of the use of dialogue, and also that you're telling a story in some ways. So I'm wondering how you transition, and whether some of your playwriting skills inform the poetry and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that you pointed at that particular poem, because for people who've read or seen the Vibrator play,
Which I loved.
oh, thank you, so nice. There's part of that stanza is actually in the play. So there were times when I would sort of wholesale steal lines of poetry and sneak them into plays. And then I kind of stopped doing that. It seemed like the play should have its own form, and I shouldn't be sneaking these fragments in. But I guess there became a time where I saw the form of a play as a poem, so I no longer needed to sneak
Mm-hmm.
from one form to another. Oh, and I wanted to say, not to be distracted, but in the chat, which I see on the right, I don't know if you all are following the chat, but Tom said if you want to ask questions, feel free to chime in. I'm sure Jill and I could also just keep talking, because it would be so nice to go have a glass of wine with you or tea and actually talk. So there's plenty for us to talk about without other questions. And I had one for you too about catharsis and trauma. There's one line from your book where you say, once we name it, does it cease to matter? And I was thinking about that, about once we name a thing, is there catharsis? And in terms of the excavations which you did, which must be incredibly painful, around your sister and the loss of her, which you'd already written about in prose, right?
Yes, yes.
Was there catharsis at the end of the writing? I mean, was it a form of healing or not?
It's such a, I, I, I think that what writing Asylum showed me in some ways is that, the idea of forever grief. We think about grief as being, at least I do, as being, something that acute grief that happens after a loss, and the processing of this acute grief. But, I've come to realize that really grief is forever, and the word doesn't quite even say what it is, because you keep, as you go through life and with memories and associations, grieving still, in some ways, like even like the trees in my poem, and I loved how you talk about the trees as bearing witness. I think that's what I think about more, as bearing witness rather than a catharsis, in a way, although I have to say that language itself for me is such a necessity and joy. So if that is catharsis, then, I really feel that it's so essential for me, and I'm sure for you as well.
Well, and I love that you speak of joy when you speak of writing. I know so many writers who don't speak of the joy. And for me, there is a great deal of joy in
Yeah.
the practice of it. And
Yeah.
now I'm seeing in the chat that we both, or maybe just me, said John's name wrong. Your
Oh,
host is actually named John, not Tom. I'm so sorry, John.
Okay, it's okay.
I'm going to write you a poem called An Ode to John, not Tom. It's gonna rhyme. Do you want to take some of those questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple here from the chat. Amy wants to know, or Amy's mom, Christine, wants to know, Sarah, you talk about slowness of life under COVID-19. In this slowness, have you discovered new understandings about life and writing? And that's for Sarah and Jill. Jill, would you like to go first?
Let's see. I find this time of COVID so strange. I still feel like I haven't gained my rhythm in it, because we don't know when it's going to be ending, in a strange way. And I don't know, I was just saying to my husband the other day, I can't believe it's September. Like, it just, all time seems to somehow have no meaning for me right now. I every day, feels like, just put one foot in front of the other and do what's required, to get through responsibilities, and So I'm hoping, for me, I think writing is the way that I process and understand, learn, not, I think writing is a way in which I process. And I'll just briefly say that one day in March, we were taking a long walk. There are these trails where I'm in quarantine right now, these long, beautiful trails. And we came upon a lighthouse. And that for me just, became kind of this symbol of, as long as we could keep walking to this lighthouse, then one day it's all going to sort of resolve itself. So that was what kept me going, is this lighthouse. And I'll probably figure out a way to write about it.
Yeah, that's beautiful, the image of a lighthouse. I mean, I think it's really thrown me back into solitary process, which I think has been good in its way. I mean, I think with playwriting, so much of your life, you have part solitary time, but then a lot of it is meetings and auditions, and there's a busyness to it, and kind of buzzing around, and I miss that terribly, but I can't have it, and I might not be able to have it for another year and a half or more, we don't know. So so I've really been taking pleasure in writing prose and writing poetry, and I've been doing a little practice of writing a haiku a day, which gives me pleasure. And sometimes I write them about absurd topics, like, the cooking of tater tots during quarantine. And sometimes, they're about more traditionally poetic material. But I think to remember that you just have an alive brain during quarantine, that few syllables seems like about the right amount of syllables for quarantine, because it is so hard, I find, to be focused during this time. And I do find nature to be a real comfort right now. The silent witnesses of trees that are in your poems, or the lighthouse, or if you can get to the water, and a real sense of gratitude for my family right now. So I guess a shifting towards hopefully gratitude and fewer syllables.
Sarah, are you able to do any of the work that you do as a playwright on Zoom, like the meetings and auditions and readings of the play?
Not so much. I mean, a lot of people are doing it. I've done just a wee bit of it, but not a huge amount. I mean, I think it's helpful as a way to check in with the medium, but most of my projects are kind of really postponed. So not so much, I guess.
Question from Sharon. Can you speak to how writing to process trauma is then transformed into art? So something about that process. Jill, would you like to speak first?
Well, I mean, I suppose that one never knows if the trauma will be transformed into art. So in other words, when I'm crafting a poem or a piece of prose, it's a huge leap of faith. I think that we sometimes forget that whether something is going to work or not. And so for me, the hope is that there will be that transformation into art, meaning that a reader will be able to hear a voice in a piece of writing that communicates something to them. And of course, beauty is important to me. I find beauty to be a real restorative and transformative thing. Thing isn't the right word, but I think that that's what I reach toward, is beauty through trauma, and I hope that it will somehow transform into what I'm writing.
I think it's beautiful what you say about a leap of faith, that one doesn't really know. Will it transform? Is it
Right.
transforming, or is it just my own trauma? That is the leap of faith. And I remember when I wrote this play Eurydice, it was about my father dying. He died of cancer when I was 20, and I remember when I first wrote it, it still felt so raw to the touch to hear it out loud in front of strangers that I just locked myself in the bathroom after hearing it. It was at New Dramatists in New York, and just sobbed and thought, why did I think that was a good idea to share it with strangers? That was a horrible idea. And then through the repetition of hearing it out loud, it became other people's and not
Mhm.
mine. And I think it was the process of it belonging to others that it became artful and not my own trauma. So I think it's something about the movement out from self to other for me that does that alchemy. But I
Mhm.
think you're right. You never know. You never quite know.
Right. Yes. I too, you hid in the closet. I remember lying lying down on my floor, when I finished my memoir. I really wasn't even sure I ever would finally publish it, but it was such a relief to finally. There is this sense when you finish a project and it's done and you can't tinker with it anymore, that you've moved away in some ways. That to me is a wonderful, it's not yours anymore.
Mhm.
A book, I think of a book, and I'm a book editor, as you know, as a gift to the reader,
Mhm.
a gift of empathy, um, certainly with fiction and poetry.
Mhm.
Nonfiction is a different genre in that way. But
And I do think, with the physical book, there's something about holding a book in your hands and the giving of a book where it's sort of like, okay, it's the reader's turn to hold my trauma. Here you go. But like, hopefully the trauma is art at that point, but you really feel it can be held in someone's hands. And with a book, it actually physically can be. With a play, it's more like the audience has to hold it in their body,
yes,
and the actor transmits it through their body. So it's a different kind of alchemy. And I'm just seeing in the chat, I wonder if this means we're supposed to, does that mean we should kind of wrap things up? Because there's a wonderful talk coming after us that I know they're preparing
yeah.
for.
There's no hurry. If you have any sort of parting words or any recommendations for poets we should be reading as we ease out of quarantine.
Mm-hmm. Jill, you but must have amazing
Well, here I am. Actually, I have my poetry library here from when I was an undergraduate and then graduate school. So I have so many books by poets that I love, like Louise Gluck and Jory Graham and Stanley Plumley, Frank Bedard, so many. So many poets to turn to. I think the wonderful thing about, and also, by the way, McNally Jackson has a great poetry section, so I'll give a shout out to that. When I go for events at bookshops, I love to go to the poetry section and see what's there. So I have nothing specific to recommend, only to say that for people who are interested in reading poetry. We're lucky to have these sites like the Poetry Foundation or Academy of American Poets, Poetry Society of America, Poetry Daily, where you can find, poets and then go buy their books. And as a poetry editor, I really wish people would buy more poetry books. It's such a beautiful, important art, and the media doesn't have enough time for it.
But we have enough time now. We
Yes.
we have enough time, and then poems are the perfect length for our distracted souls, I think.
True. A lot of my friends have told me that they're so distracted they can't read a novel right now. So that's a good point.
I barely can read a novel.
Yeah,
Poems have felt perfect to me right now. I have really been enjoying your book and Jericho Brown's work.
Right.
And Ruth Stone just has a new book of uncollected poems out, which I've really loved. And Lee Young Lee's The Undressing, I really loved during quarantine.
Oh, good. I edited that book.
You did? It's so beautiful.
Yeah, he's an amazing poet.
Yeah.
Really gorgeous, spiritual.
Yeah.
Yes, all of those poets you mentioned, I'm also fans of.
Yeah. And I think that might be all we have time for, but Jill and Sarah, thank you so much for this really wonderful conversation. The links to buy the books from McNally Jackson are there in the chat. You'll also see them on the front banner at McNallyJackson.com. I hope you'll consider ordering from us. You can pick up your order from any one of our 4 stores, or we can ship it straight to your home. But yeah, just thank you again, Jill, Sarah, and everybody who tuned in. That was a lot of fun.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. It was beautiful.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you all for coming.
Have a good night, everybody.